Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel and Chaos podcast promoting mindful communication and growth through conflict. So this video is the third in the series that I'm doing on how to resolve disputes with neighbours. And this is kind of based on my kind of about 15 years of experience of working in mediation of neighbour disputes and providing conflict coaching in situations as well. And this is the third video. The first one being about the early stages of a dispute and things that you may want to consider in dealing with a dispute with your neighbour in those early stages before it starts to escalate. The second video was about it's now a complaint, so that was looking at where you've already decided to go ahead with an actual formalised complaint to someone like the ASB team, antisocial behaviour team in your local authority, the noise team, environmental health department, or kind of traffic or streets department, depending what it's called, for parking kinds of disputes. And that kind of situation, sometimes to the police, but as I mentioned in video 2, the police are often not going to become involved in neighbour disputes, even though they might sometimes be called. They're not really the best agency to deal with it. Obviously, if there's violence and criminality, then they are, but in a sense, that's not about a neighbour dispute. That's just about the actions of the person involved or people involved being violent. But most neighbour disputes, the police won't be appropriate. But many of those other departments and agencies that I mentioned will be. And so that video number 2 looked at that kind of issue. But today's video is going to be looking at where a neighbour dispute has become very long-term and entrenched. So by that I mean that sometimes neighbour disputes could have lasted 2 or 3 years, maybe longer in some cases, and the issues are very much entrenched, and there may be various counter allegations. There might even have been legal action. There may even sometimes have been kind of suggestions of violence, and possibly even some kind of criminal charges on that, but sometimes allegations of violence where there's no evidence. And so it's simply become kind of very entrenched and kind of stressful and fearful because of that. But in other cases, it may be that it's become a legal process alongside all the other things going on, and it's started to become very stressful, very expensive, etc. So that's the kind of situation I want to talk about today, and the kinds of things that I've observed in the past, being how people may have dealt with those situations either effectively or ineffectively. And the important thing I need to say, as I hope I have emphasised throughout these, is I'm not trying to prescribe for you what you do. I just want to help you to consider what you feel are the best choices for you in the situation, which are about trying to deal with the actual issue that's arisen so that you can avoid making it a kind of a personal war with the person who lives next door to you. Because when it becomes personal, it's more about you trying to kind of demonize them for being a bad person, rather than simply focusing on what is the issue that I've got a problem with here. Is it an overhanging tree branch? Is it a fence? Is it trees that are, casting shadow over my garden? Is it noise? Is it parking? Is it rubbish being put in a certain place? So that your focus can remain on what the issue is, rather than simply it being a personal battle with your neighbour. Because then, by keeping the focus on the issue, it means, in a sense, it can allow you to simply deal with that, rather than have to get into a kind of war of words or abuse or even threats with your neighbour. So it means you're not contributing to that, you're not initiating that. Because the second that starts, often most disputes just remain stuck, and there's very little that any agency can do to take steps to deal with that, because it's more about a personal issue between you and your neighbour. So long-term and entrenched, what do I mean by that? I mean there may have been legal action, and in some cases, I'll give you an anecdote of a situation in relation to this. In some cases, that legal action may have left one or both neighbours very, very financially affected. But if it's been some kind of civil case where one neighbour has taken action against the other neighbour, perhaps over something like a fence or a wall or some other kind of environmental issue, literally people can end up with tens of thousands of pounds legal charges. And that's one of the things I want to kind of ask you to consider during this session, where if it's got to that stage, to what extent you feel it's necessary to take legal action. Because if you lose, it's a question of whether you are prepared for the consequences of losing, and what your considerations are about whether you want to take legal action. One of the things that's a feature of situations that become long-term and entrenched is that it's very likely that people have kind of lost track of that thing that I'm saying about whether it's an issue, anymore a challenge over an issue, or whether it's become very personal. Because it's amazing sometimes how issues which really in themselves are quite small, because they've become very personal, because people have felt very threatened by them, it's that kind of personal aspect that's led them to take action. I'm not going to lose this fight, I'm standing up for my principles and things like that. But of course, again, that's likely to be what the other neighbour is doing as well. And so the escalation of it to a legal case, and the financial consequences, as well as the stress that can arise from that, are enormous. So it's not for me to say you should or you shouldn't do that, but I really would ask you to consider if that's something that's on your kind of list to consider, or you are already engaged in it. What are you expecting from it? What are the potential consequences? And do you feel clear that that is what you want to pursue? So I'll give you the anecdote that I'm speaking of here. I think it's probably one of the most emotionally upsetting neighbour mediation cases. I've worked in other areas which can be quite upsetting, but the most upsetting neighbour mediation cases that I've ever kind of been involved in was two elderly couples. They were in their 70s, I think, possibly even moving towards 80. They were both very similar in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their history. They both the husbands had been in the war as in different services, and they'd lived next door to each other for, I think, probably about 40 to 50 years. So they'd lived there all their lives, both of them. They'd been friends for most of their lives. But over an issue pertaining to a garage at the back of one of their homes being knocked down, and things happening as a result of that affecting the other neighbour, and also then an overhanging gutter and some building work associated with that, they had a persistent kind of dispute over it. It had ended up going to court. One of the neighbours represented themselves in court. The other one had commissioned a solicitor. The one that represented themselves lost the case and had, as a consequence, I won't say the figures because some of these things are going to be confidential, but it was tens of thousands of pounds charge on their property as a consequence of the legal action. And they came to mediation because they were recommended that by the judge, who just said, you've got to try to work this out between you. You can't keep coming back to court on this. Look at the impact it's having on you. So they came for mediation, but in a sense, the person who'd lost the case and had the massive costs was really only interested in almost appealing their case, rather than trying to resolve the situation so that it stopped, continuing. And so in a sense, their purpose for mediation wasn't appropriate. They were really still wanting to go back to court to appeal the case. So in a sense, it shows how entrenched it had become. and how there was this kind of determination for one or the other to win, and the costs for them. And in both cases, the wives of in both families had attributed some serious illnesses that they were experiencing to the stress of their neighbour dispute. Now, this is what I kind of want to address. Is it's terrible that this happens, but often, that's where it's left. It's, oh, isn't it terrible that this happens? If you're involved in a dispute like this, you may feel, I'm going to win, I'm determined to win, it's outrageous what they've done, they're terrible people. But if you do take legal action, it really can be, are you certain you're going to win? And obviously you can never be certain you're going to win a legal battle. And one of the things I'm slightly disappointed sometimes is how easily it seems some solicitors will still pursue these kinds of cases without there being that much clarity that there's much chance of winning. They're doing it simply, they may say, oh, well, we're doing it because the clients wanted us to. But what I tend to find is that, and this just isn't just in neighbour disputes, it can be in employment legal actions as well, like going to tribunals. What a lot of people who commission a solicitor don't do is they don't really stay in touch with what the solicitor's doing. With many cases, they don't really even know always what the angle or the case being made is that their solicitor is doing for them. They've just kind of handed it over in the hope that it's going to get resolved. But sometimes if you listen to your own solicitor, if you've commissioned one, and you listen to your own solicitor and say, so what is the angle that you're taking on this, and what's the law that you feel might apply, and how strongly do you think we've got a case, and really scrutinise what they're doing, because it's your case and it's going to cost you tens of thousands of pounds to only then be clear that you want to pursue the legal action. Because so often I think people just say, oh, it's over my head, I don't really know what they're doing, but we've handed it over to them. And then afterwards, if they lose, they've got enormous legal bills as a consequence, and then the stress associated with that. And as I say, in this particular situation, a couple who had a tens of thousands of pounds charge on their property, and they're in their 70s to 80s. So strictly, you might expect that their mortgage had been paid off long ago. But now instead they've got a 10, 20, 30, 40,000 pound charge against their property. So it really is a question of, over something like some guttering, or over a garage being knocked down, and maybe that causing a difficulty as a consequence, what is your wish with it? Is it your determination to win the legal case, or is it to resolve the dispute? And as I say, in so many cases when it's got to a legal case over a neighbour dispute, people have kind of lost sight of what's actually happening to them in the process of what they're doing. And they're pursuing the legal dispute almost out of dogged determination to win. And as I say, it's not for me to say you should or you shouldn't, because every situation is going to be different. I know there have been situations I've been involved in where I'm absolutely clear I would have taken legal action over things if it proved necessary. But I was always clear that I knew whether it was important I did, or whether there are other ways of dealing with things, and what I might be risking if I did. I've never had this kind of serious situation where it really is almost like desperation. People are just doing anything that's left to them to try to deal with it. So as I say, it's not for me to decide for you. What I am saying is, what's the basis for your decision? Is it you just are so determined to win that it kind of doesn't matter on what basis you're doing it? You're just going to win, and you're putting all your money on the table, or you're putting all your eggs in one basket, however you want to describe it. And it's kind of like, just hang the consequences. Because if that is the case, it really could be a very difficult situation afterwards if you don't win. But if you're doing it because you thought, right, yeah, I do feel clear about this, I do feel my solicitor has presented to me that there's a strong chance of me winning, I do understand the basis on which they're taking things forward, I therefore do wish to pursue this, absolutely fine. You're making your own clear decision. But if you are finding that it's just like, oh, I've tried everything and this is the only thing that's left to me, it may not be the only thing that's left to you, because the other thing that's left to you is you may save yourself an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of stress by not pursuing a legal action, and accept that this thing about the overhanging gutter or the high hedge or the fence is not as significant in your life as desperation to win the argument. But that's got to be your decision. But this is what I mean about some of the terrible situations I've seen people get into over neighbour disputes, is it's become so personal to them that they've just put everything into it, and on the occasions they've lost, the situation they find themselves is just horrible for them. And the resentment and the despair and the frustration that they feel, and ultimately very little has changed in their circumstances as a consequence. Obviously you might win, but how clear are you about your chances? That's the thing. As I say, if you're clear, if you've really thought it through, if you've considered everything, if you've also considered, well, what might I do if I don't win? How confident do I feel in my solicitor? Are they able to explain to me clearly why they feel I've got a good chance of winning? And you've done all of that, and you're making a measured consideration, then obviously you will decide that you want to pursue it. But what I'm kind of looking at here is, what is your kind of approach to this? How are you seeing that situation, or what other options do you have that are not only about going to court over it, as if it's just the only thing left to you, the last desperate attempt? Because if that is how you feel about it, it would seem to be, from the experiences I've seen happening, that is the one that's most risky. That if it's just like, there's nothing left for me, I've got to do this, that issue over the fence is so important that I'm willing to, have a charge on my property, or even end up having to sell my home to pay the legal costs, depending on where it is. If it's like that, I'm just kind of saying, what would help you to stop and consider that? I guess this is like a sales pitch, but at the same time, a 1.5 to 2 hour conflict coaching session might help you just to think through those things. And obviously mediation, even at this extreme stage of a neighbour dispute, is always available as a way of trying to resolve difficulties, but it might not be that that's something that's possible. The other neighbour may not want it, you may not want it. But conflict coaching, where you can just stop and have a one-to-one discussion with someone who's not going to give you advice, they're just going to help you talk through, what am I doing? Why do I want to do this? What if I don't get what I want? How am I dealing with it? What other possibilities do I have? So they'll be helping you to reflect on what your thinking is behind what you're doing, just to give you some space to take some time out to think about it. What's important to you? How do you feel about these things? How is it affecting you to be involved in this dispute? Those kinds of questions will be what a conflict coach will help you to reflect on, and consider whether, whatever your next choices of actions are, whether they do feel right for you. And if they do, great, you're sorted. But so often people don't take that kind of time out to stop and think, what's really important to me here? So that is where mediation and conflict coaching could help you. But as I say, I'm not ever wanting to say you have to have those processes. There are always ways in which you can stop and take time to reflect for yourself. But it's where people have stopped considering those things, and they just kind of desperately, one after another, are trying to kind of have this war with someone, that it often ends up very badly for everybody involved. So that's what I would say. That's the anecdote. This is the thing to consider. Other things I would say, just as I say, the things that can come up, in some cases people literally do decide to move home. And again, I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. To be honest, people think about moving home even at the start of neighbour disputes. There's this difficulty arises, they feel very uncomfortable addressing it. Their thoughts can be, oh, I'll just move out, particularly if they're renting, rather than all the upheaval it would cause if they had to sell their home and move on. But it's a very quick reaction that a lot of people have to neighbour disputes. They immediately think, oh, I'm going to move, rather than actually deal with it. And sometimes that may just be the right choice. Just as in workplace disputes, sometimes people don't think, I'm not going to bother dealing with this hassle I'm feeling at work. I'm just going to find a different job. I've got the choices. I've got the skills. I can move very easily. I don't really want to put myself through the hassle of trying to deal with it. And people make that choice. But obviously when it's come to this kind of stage, the more extreme stage, that's always still an option for you. But again, only if it feels right for you. But some people do decide that it's not a weakness, it's just a choice. But you also, are entirely understandably likely to want to stay. But any of these kind of considerations are the kinds of things that come up for people at these stages. And in order to just look after yourself, that's the most important thing. That's what I would say at every stage of the dispute, is to look after yourself first and foremost, rather than making beating or demonizing your neighbour more important than looking after your needs. That's the most important thing, is that if you're able to look after yourself, sometimes when people focus on looking after themselves rather than the problems with their neighbours, they decide actually what they're doing isn't such a problem to me after all. But if it is still a problem, then you're coming from a place of greater strength and greater kind of centeredness, I suppose you could describe it, if you've made sure that you're looking after yourself first. In so many disputes where people feel very desperate, it is that they've lost track of looking after themselves first and foremost, and all their energy is going into try to kind of defeat the other person. Whereas if you have started to do that, if you can move back to a place of thinking, what's most important for me here? What do I need? However serious this has got, what's the most important thing for me? Rather than focusing on how am I going to defeat this other person? What are all the things that they're doing that I hate and I want to, show up to be wrong, etc., etc. If that's more important to you than just looking after yourself, in time you'll get worn out because you won't have the energy left to kind of keep going with it. So the most important thing I would say at all times is to consider your own needs first, and then decide what actions you want to take to deal with your neighbour dispute. Yeah, I think that's really the most important things I would say. I do always want to emphasise that mediation can be used at any stage, and if not mediation, because for whatever reason both of you have decided that's not something you would ever want to engage in, conflict coaching, just as some time out to help you think, what's important to me here, how can I move forward with this. As long as you understand that conflict coaching isn't like perhaps a lawyer would give you or an advocate would give you, trying to help you decide how you can win a case against the other person. Conflict coaching is helping you to look at how you most self-supportingly take your situation forward. So it's not about trying to beat the other person. Conflict coaching isn't about that. It's about you being given a chance to say, this is the conflict I have. I would like to get the best outcome for me that helps me to return to having comfort and peace in my own home, or whatever it is, however it is you would describe it. But the conflict coach isn't going to help you to kind of find ways to undermine your neighbour and beat them. That might be in different ways of saying it, what a solicitor might do to help you win your case against the neighbour. Conflict coaching is helping you to just come to terms with, how am I dealing with this conflict? Is it working for me? Does it feel right for me? What's the thing that will support me most, even if this conflict continues? Even if I don't get what I want from the council, even if I don't get what I want from the police, etc. What can I still do to help me deal with this dispute that I've got with another person, but in a way which isn't trying to damage them. It's just trying to deal with the fact that they're behaving in ways that I find difficult. So that would be what conflict coaching can offer you. And often at this kind of stage where it's perhaps less likely people want to use mediation, but even that I wouldn't exclude. A lot of mediations I provide have been for people who are at this kind of, desperate stage where they both would like a better way out of it than pursuing a kind of an adversarial approach, whether it's a grievance procedure at work or a legal procedure with a neighbour dispute. So mediation is still a possibility. And again, please don't listen to anyone who says it's not. If they say, oh, it's too late for that, that's not their decision, it's your decision. But if for whatever reason your neighbour doesn't want mediation, then conflict coaching, just to help you to think through what's best for you, is also an option. But the main thing I would say is that if you are watching this because you're involved in that more extreme kind of situation, the first thing I'd say is I'm really sorry that you're in that situation, because it is horrible. I've seen what people experience, what they go through, the fears that they have, the frustrations, the despair they might feel towards a lot of the agencies that are involved, and the stress ongoingly of dealing with it. But I hope any of the 3 videos that I've done have helped you just to think through what feels right for you, because ultimately the most important thing is for you to come back to a sense of kind of comfort and peace and kind of just kind of acceptance of your situation and finding it a nice thing to do to live in your own home. If you've got any questions, please put them in the comments box or just contact me directly. I'm happy to answer them. If you'd like conflict coaching, that's obviously something that's available, but my aim here really is just to help you think through your neighbour disputes. If you've liked it, please click the like button. If you would like to hear or watch more of these videos and listen to these podcasts, please subscribe to listen and watch future ones. And thanks very much for listening as always, and have a good day. Bye bye.